The first thing Fleet-Commander Verath-Ossul noticed when the preliminary reports came in from the Kelorian border skirmish was that the casualty numbers didn't make any sense. Not in the way numbers sometimes don't make sense when a junior analyst fat-fingers a data entry. No, they didn't make sense the way a dream doesn't make sense when you are inside it. When the wrongness is right there in front of you, but your brain refuses to fire the alarm. Verath had been reading casualty reports for 63 standard cycles. He knew what they looked like. He knew the rhythms, the ratios, the dull, terrible arithmetic of engagement losses. 6 Kelorian cruisers against a single human vessel, a thing they'd called a destroyer, which was a word that in retrospect should have been taken more literally, should have produced a report where the destroyer was the wreckage and the 6 cruisers limped home. Instead he was holding a holographic readout that told him 5 of the 6 were gone, not damaged, not retreating, gone, as in debris fields, as in dispersed plasma, as in whatever atoms had once constituted 340 Kelorian lives were now floating somewhere in the cold, indifferent dark between stars. The 6th cruiser had returned. Its commander, a young officer named Verath-Ossul, daughter of a decorated admiral, 18 years of service, had been found in the medical bay, sitting cross-legged on the floor, unable to stop blinking. She hadn't spoken coherently for 11 days. Verath set the report down on his command table. Outside the viewport, the gas giant Remos turned its slow, ancient shoulder toward him, banded in amber and ivory, utterly unbothered by what was happening in the unremarkable system, 3 sectors to the coreward. He wished he could be Remos. He genuinely did. "Get me High Admiral Porath," he said to nobody in particular, because on a flagship of this class there was always somebody to say things to. And somebody find out who authorized first contact protocols for the human border. Somebody made a decision, and I want to know whose desk it came from. The problem, and Verath had been turning this over like a stone you find in your shoe, the one that's smooth enough you can't quite locate it. The problem was that the Kelorian Directorate had not technically done anything wrong. When the Unified Galactic Survey had first catalogued the humans, barely 80 years ago, the survey teams had come back with assessments that were, depending on your political leaning, either reassuringly dismissive or catastrophically stupid. Verath had read the original Voss-Harlan report, the one every military academy still used as a case study in xenological methodology. Brilliant work, genuinely. Voss-Harlan had observed human settlements on 14 different colony worlds, recorded thousands of hours of behavioral data, analyzed social structures, communication patterns, technological indices. The conclusions: humans are a moderately advanced spacefaring species, exhibiting strong territorial instincts, notable emotional volatility, and a marked tendency toward intraspecies conflict. Their military technology, while locally functional, is estimated at Class 4 by galactic standard measurements. Threat assessment. LOL. Expansion containment protocols recommended. Class 4. The Kelorian Directorate was Class 8. The Tharan hegemony, the most powerful nation-state in the known galaxy, sat comfortably at Class 9. Class 4 was roughly equivalent to the Miras Collective, who were peaceful herbivores that had never successfully prosecuted a war in 400 years of spacefaring history. Somebody had looked at that report, and at the expansion of human colonies along the Kelorian border, and made a decision that felt at the time entirely reasonable. Push them back. Show them where the line is. 6 cruisers should be more than enough to persuade a Class 4 species to reconsider their territorial ambitions. 11 days later. Medical bay floor. Blinking. Verath was still thinking about Verath-Ossul, about what she'd seen that had emptied her out like that, when his communication officer, a young male whose name he could never remember, something with too many consonants, cleared his throat with exactly the kind of cautious energy that meant the news was going to be worse. "Sir," the officer said, "we have received a transmission from the human vessel, the one that destroyed 5 of our cruisers." "Yes, sir. Technically, it sustained significant damage during the engagement. It's operating at approximately 40% capacity." Verath turned from the viewport. 40%. "Yes, sir. And it's transmitting." "Yes, sir." It appears to be the officer. Consulted something, and his facial crest, which in Kelorian biology served the same social function as human eyebrows, flattened in a way that communicated something between confusion and deep personal distress. "It appears to be requesting permission to return to its home system for repairs, and it has attached a message for the Kelorian Directorate High Command. Put it through." The message was text only, No visual component, no audio signature, just words rendered in standard galactic script, which meant the humans had a translator sophisticated enough to handle the conversion. Another data point that should have been alarming somebody a long time ago. The message read, "To the Kelorian Directorate. We note that your vessels engaged our ship without prior declaration of hostilities. We note further that this occurred in a system that falls within the colonial jurisdiction of the human Terran Republic, under the Juno Compact of Territorial Establishment. We are prepared to discuss this matter through diplomatic channels. However, we wish to make one thing unambiguously clear. If a second engagement occurs before diplomatic contact is established, we will treat it as an act of war." Signed, Captain Mara Elena Vasquez, HTR Destroyer Unbroken, hull registration 7 Foxtrot November. Verath read it twice. He read the word unambiguously 4 times, because there was something about the way it sat there flat, dry, no theatrical language, no demands for tribute or territory, that unsettled him more than a threat would have. Threats he understood. Threats followed a script. This was a woman at 40% capacity who had just destroyed 5 warships, and she wanted to talk, and she'd said unambiguously, like she meant it right down to her bones. "Get me everything we have on the human species," he said. "And I mean everything: survey data, border incident reports, intercepted communications, cultural analyses, everything, and find out who the hell Mara Elena Vasquez is." What came back, over the next 72 hours, did not make Verath feel better. What it did do was gradually replace his confusion with something closer to a cold, creeping understanding. The kind that settles into you slowly rather than arriving all at once. Like the frost on a viewport when the heating system is quietly failing. You don't notice it at first. Then one morning you breathe on the glass and realize it's been coming for a long time. The cultural analysis, compiled by 3 different xenological institutes across the Directorate, cross-referenced with the original Voss-Harlan data, all agreed on the surface-level observations. Humans were, by galactic standards, a young species. Barely 160,000 years of evolutionary separation from their nearest primate ancestor. They had achieved spaceflight only 3 centuries ago. They were extraordinarily small by multi-species comparison. Most adult humans massed between 60 and 100 kilograms, which put them at roughly half the body weight of an average Kelorian adult. Their sensory capabilities were middling at best. They could not detect radiation in the standard useful spectra. Their hearing was limited to a comparatively narrow band. Their olfactory sense, once quite sophisticated, had degraded significantly over their evolutionary history, to the point that many Kelorian analysts considered it essentially vestigial. On paper, they were prey animals wearing the skin of a civilization. What the analysts kept skirting around, noting in footnotes, mentioning in qualifications, burying in appendices, was a set of physiological and psychological data that didn't fit the prey animal model at all. One researcher named Corva Thel, working out of the Puristani Institute, had written a 90-page supplementary analysis that nobody at command had apparently read, because if anyone had read it, they might not have sent 6 cruisers to the Kelorian border. Verath read it now, all 90 pages. Corvatu's central argument, laid out with the careful precision of someone who knows they are going to be ignored and is building the paper trail anyway, was this: the mistake everyone kept making was treating humans as if their primary survival strategy was avoidance. Almost every spacefaring species that had developed out of a prey animal evolutionary origin, and there were dozens of them, had done so by becoming very, very good at not being eaten. Speed, camouflage, burrowing, schooling behaviors, collective alarm systems. Humans, Korvax Thel pointed out, had done none of these things. Humans, it turned out, were not prey animals who had accidentally become civilized. They were, in the strict evolutionary biology sense, persistence hunters. The phrase was almost quaint. Korvax Thel spent 11 pages explaining what it meant, because no other known spacefaring species had a cognate concept. The short version was this: in the pre-technological evolutionary history of humans, the dominant hunting strategy on their homeworld, used by their direct ancestors, used by the species for roughly 2 million years before they developed projectile weapons, was to chase prey animals to death, not to outrun them, not to trap them or ambush them, to follow them, to keep following them, to follow them across distances that, by any other species assessment, were absurd, to follow them in conditions of heat and cold and injury and exhaustion until the prey animal simply stopped because it couldn't understand why something wouldn't give up and dropped. Verath set the report down, picked it up again. Read the section on human cardiovascular adaptation, the enlarged heart chambers, the extraordinary thermoregulation through perspiration, the fact that humans were one of a tiny handful of species that couldn't be exhausted by sustained physical effort the way other animals could, at least not on any timeline that the prey animal could survive. And then read the section on human psychological response to threat. Most species, when sufficiently threatened, triggered neurochemical cascades designed to facilitate either immediate combat or immediate escape. The Kelorian threat response, for example, lasted approximately 40 to 70 standard minutes before cognitive functions overwhelmed the emotional response and rational assessment resumed. This was standard. This was how intelligent beings were supposed to work. The body fires up, you deal with the threat. The body stands down. Humans had a threat response that Verath-Ossul noted this with the exhausted air of someone who had triple-checked the data, didn't fully resolve, not in the conventional sense. Once a human identified something as a threat, particularly a threat to themselves or to what they categorized as their group, and human group bonding behaviors were themselves a separate and equally alarming area of research. They entered a state that Verath-Ossul had coined sustained vigilant hostility, which was a very clinical way of saying they didn't stop. They adapted. They problem-solved. They experienced fear. Clearly, demonstrably, the biochemical markers were right there in the data. But fear, in humans, had somehow been co-opted by their persistence-hunting neurology into a motivator rather than a limiter. They were afraid, and they kept coming anyway. For 2 million years, that had been how they ate. Verath's communications officer, Velen. The name was Velen. He'd finally asked knock twice and then entered without waiting. Bad form. Technically, but Verath had been sitting in the same position for 6 hours, and Velen had the good sense to recognize when the fleet commander needed someone to interrupt him. "Sir," Velen said, "the High Admiral is on the line, and he paused, which he didn't normally do. "There's been an incident at the Drava relay station." The Drava relay station was technically a civilian communications installation. It sat at the edge of Kelorian-administered space, about 12 light-years from the border system where the Unbroken had destroyed 5 cruisers. The incidents were almost certainly unrelated. Almost certainly. Verath told himself this as he moved to the communications console, though he'd already felt something shift in his chest, some deep ancestral barometer that had nothing to do with rational analysis. What kind of incident? Velen's facial crest flattened again. Worse this time. A human vessel dropped out of jump at the relay station's position and requested docking clearance for emergency repairs. The station administrator, a civilian named Osoro Fen, refused. Station protocol for non-allied vessels. And the human vessel, it was a civilian ship, sir, a freighter, transmitted a single message after the refusal and then docked anyway. Verath stopped moving. It docked anyway. It appears their crew were in medical distress. Life support failure. The station medical team treated 4 human crew members. They are currently in stable condition, and the ship's engineering team repaired their life support with components they sourced from the station's supply inventory. Administrator Osorofen has filed a formal complaint. What was the message they sent before docking? Velen read it from his data pad. "We have injured crew. We are coming in. Please have medical personnel ready. Not may we dock. Not we request emergency clearance. We are coming in," like it was already decided, like the refusal had been received and acknowledged and considered, and then, with the serene practicality of someone who's done the math and gotten the same answer twice, set aside. Verath had a thought, then unbidden, the kind that arrives fully formed and a little embarrassing, that maybe the word destroyer had not been a functional designation. Maybe it had been a warning label. High Admiral Verath was a small woman by Kelorian standards, which still put her at 2 meters and something, built like a siege weapon in a dress uniform, with a history of military command stretching back to the 3rd expansion campaign. She had fought the Tharans to a standstill at the Battle of Osavin, a fact the Tharans still disputed and she still didn't care about. In 37 years of flag rank she had dealt with the Miras Collective, the Durrani pirates, a civil war, 2 coup attempts and 1 extremely confusing first contact situation involving a species that communicated entirely through bioluminescent flatulence. She was not, as a general rule, easily rattled. She looked rattled. She'd been rattled, Verath suspected, since the Unbroken incident, though she'd hidden it well for about a week and a half before it started showing around the edges of her composure, like light under a door. Now, 3 weeks into the crisis that Command was still officially calling a border misunderstanding and which everyone in the fleet was calling the human problem, Verath sat across from him in the strategy room aboard his flagship and looked like a woman who had not slept well in some time. "Tell me something useful," she said. "Define useful. Tell me something that doesn't make me feel like we have made a terrible mistake." Verath thought about that, thought about Corvathel and persistence hunting, thought about Telvar Sue, still in the medical bay, still blinking, thought about the message from Captain Vasquez. Unambiguously, "We will treat it as an act of war," and the freighter crew who had received a refusal and simply parked in it, thanked the medical staff afterward, and filed with the station administrator for reimbursement of the supply components they'd taken, with the correct forms, properly completed. "The human diplomatic envoy arrives in 14 days, he said. "The Terran Republic's foreign ministry has designated a negotiator named Solomon Park. His service record is military, 22 years in their space forces before transitioning to the diplomatic corps. He's handled 6 previous interspecies negotiations. He has a reputation for patience." "Patience," Verath said. It was not the word she'd been hoping for. "The Terran Republic has issued a formal statement through Galactic Network channels. It characterizes the incident as an unprovoked attack on a Republic vessel in Republic-adjacent space and calls for, quote, a full and unambiguous accounting of Kelorian military intentions in the border region, accompanied by concrete guarantees against future engagement." Their civilian news media. "We have been monitoring the transmissions." Verath pulled up a display feed because this was the part he needed her to see. "Their public response has been, by our assessment, significant." The display showed excerpts from human information channels, news broadcasts, opinion programming, public commentary feeds. The xenolinguistics team had been working around the clock on translation and contextual analysis, because the language humans used in public discourse was considerably more elastic than the language of official diplomatic communications. Verath leaned forward, studying the feed. "What am I looking at?" Their leadership, elected officials, military commanders, public figures, have been issuing statements. The diplomatic language is measured. The civilian language is considerably less so. He scrolled through the analyzed excerpts. "This one is from a member of their Planetary Defense Committee," she said, and I'm quoting the translation directly. "If the Kelorian Directorate thinks we are going to sit on our hands while they shoot at our ships, they have made a category error about what kind of people they are dealing with." "This one is from a retired military officer with a significant public following," he said. "Good. I hope the Directorate saw what the Unbroken did. I hope they understood every single frame of it, and I hope somebody over there has the brains to pick up a damn phone before we have to explain it again." Verath stared at the translated text for a long moment. "Category error," she said. "Yes, sir. Before we have to explain it again." "Yes, sir." She sat back in her chair and made a sound that Verath had never heard her make before. A long, slow exhale, the kind that carries more information than words. Then she said, "Do you know what bothers me most? It's not the aggression. The aggressive ones I understand. The ones that shout and make demands and rattle whatever they have got to rattle. Those I know how to handle. What bothers me is that they don't seem angry." Verath had been thinking something similar, though he hadn't put it in quite those terms. What had struck him, reading through weeks of human communications, was the affect, or rather the lack of the affect he'd expected. They weren't frightened, or if they were, it wasn't coming through in any recognizable way. They weren't particularly vengeful either, not in the howling theatrical way the Durrani pirates had been vengeful. They were, and this was the word he kept returning to, the one Corvathel had used, resolute. Like they'd made a decision somewhere deep in their collective soul, sometime in the far distant past, and the decision was just, we don't stop. "I have been reading a xenobiological analysis," Verath said. He summarized it carefully, watching her face. "Persistence hunting. 2 million years of following prey to death. Sustained vigilant hostility. The part about fear as a motivator, the part about group bonding, and this was a section he hadn't mentioned yet, the one that had kept him awake an extra several hours. The specific data on what humans did when members of their group were harmed. Corvathel had included a behavioral case study. It was drawn from human historical records, which humans apparently documented in obsessive and occasionally bewildering detail. The case study was from their pre-space flight period, a military engagement on their homeworld, and it described what had happened when a particular human military unit, roughly 600 soldiers, had been ambushed in a terrain feature they called a valley. The ambushers had significantly superior numbers. By any standard military calculation, the unit should have surrendered or routed. Instead, and Verath-Ossul presented the historical data with the exhausted accuracy of someone who has stopped being surprised. Instead, the unit had fought for 3 days, taken casualties that would have destroyed the cohesion of any other species' military force, and then conducted an organized fighting withdrawal while requesting additional forces and already planning a counter-offensive. The case study's point was not the tactical outcome, though the tactical outcome was striking enough. The point was what the soldier interviews and historical records revealed about the subjective experience. The soldiers had been afraid, extremely afraid. In some cases there was data from written accounts, memoirs, retrospective testimony. They'd been cold and exhausted, and many of them had watched people they'd known for years die within arm's reach, and the overwhelming emotional response, documented across hundreds of individual accounts, was not despair, it was anger. Not the hot, disorganizing anger that caused other species to break formation, make mistakes, act against their own tactical interest. A cold anger, a settled anger, the kind that doesn't burn hot and go out but instead, and one of the soldiers had described it this way, in a memoir Verath-Ossul had excerpted, just became part of how you moved. Like the anger had metabolized into something structural, something that held you upright when the math of survival had already come out wrong. For 2 million years, when the prey stopped running, the hunger didn't. Verath listened to all of this without interrupting, which was not characteristic of her. When Verath finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the summarized text on the display, and then she said, "We sent 6 cruisers." "Yes." "Because the survey report said Class 4. "Yes." "And nobody read Verath-Ossul's analysis." "Apparently not. Somebody needs to read Verath-Ossul's analysis now." She tapped the table twice, with the end of one finger a Kelorian gesture that meant this matters. "This is the point, mark it. Get it distributed to every command officer on the border. Every single one. And I want behavioral assessments from intelligence on the diplomatic envoy. Park, you said, before he arrives. I want to understand what we are sitting across the table from." What intelligence came back with on Solomon Park, in the 48 hours before his shuttle docked with the diplomatic station at HFY, was dense enough that Verath read it in 3 sessions with breaks for food and something that passed for sleep. Park was 61 years old. By human reckoning, their years were shorter than Kelorian standard, but even accounting for that, he was what they'd call late middle age. He'd served as a line officer in the Terran Republic Space Force for over 2 decades, commanding vessels of escalating class, and had been present at 2 of the 6 incidents that the Republic's diplomatic archives classified as significant interspecies friction events, which was the human diplomatic corps' apparently preferred phrase for "we almost started a war." In both cases, Park had been the one who didn't. His service evaluation reports, which the intelligence team had obtained through means Verath didn't ask about, used certain words consistently: methodical, patient, decisive under pressure, demonstrates exceptional situational awareness. There was a notation, in a performance review from 8 years back, that Park shows an unusual ability to separate his personal emotional response from his professional judgment without appearing to suppress either, which makes him effective in high-stakes environments. The reviewing officer had noted this as a strength. Verath thought about it for a long time, turning that phrase "without appearing to suppress either," in the way you turn a strange object you have found, trying to figure out which end is which. The shuttle docked at 0600 station time. Verath was in the reception bay. Protocol required a greeting party of 3 officials minimum. He'd brought 5, because he'd decided sometime in the past week that he was done underestimating things. Park walked off the shuttle looking exactly like his identification photographs, which sounds like a trivial observation, but in Verath's experience it meant something. People who looked exactly like their photographs were usually people who didn't need to perform anything. He was shorter than Verath had anticipated. Most human males were. There was a persistent instinct in the brain to expect something physically formidable, and then you saw them in person and your biology registered small before your mind caught up. But he moved the way the behavioral analysis had predicted. No wasted motion, no unnecessary display, the gait of someone who has been in enough rooms where things went wrong to have learned that calmness wasn't a feeling you waited for, it was a posture you chose. He had a human aide with him, a younger woman named Chen Li, and 2 security personnel whose job was mostly ceremonial, given the diplomatic nature of the visit. He carried a small case in one hand. When he reached Verath, He stopped at a distance that the xenolinguistics briefing had labeled human comfortable professional range, slightly closer than Kelorian social convention preferred, not close enough to be aggressive, and extended his right hand. Verath had been briefed on the gesture, a greeting behavior with ancient evolutionary roots, originally intended to demonstrate that the extended hand contained no weapon. He took it. Park's grip was firm and brief and entirely without theater. "Fleet-Commander Verath-Ossul," Park said, in heavily accented but functional Kelorian standard. "Thank you for receiving me, Envoy Park." Verath released the handshake. "We have much to discuss." "We do," Park said, and the corners of his mouth moved in the way the behavioral guide had labeled slight genuine smile, non-aggressive. But his eyes, and this was the thing that stayed with Verath for the next several days, his eyes were doing something the behavioral guide hadn't quite captured. They weren't cold, exactly. They weren't hard in the way you might expect from a man whose species had just had 5 ships destroyed by his own side's single vessel. The word that came to him was patient, and he thought of Corvathel, thought of following prey across distances that made sense to no other species. They were the eyes of something that had decided to see how this played out, because it had all the time in the world, because stopping had simply never been offered as an option. "We do," Verath agreed. The first session lasted 9 hours. Park drank 3 cups of something called coffee. His aide had brought it, which the intelligence team had apparently not flagged as a potential concern, though Verath made a mental note about it, and he spoke slowly and clearly and without visible frustration, even when the Kelorian negotiators used procedural delays, even when the translation software lagged in ways that created long silences, even when Prefect Undersecretary Veris, who was present as the Directorate's senior civilian voice, and who had the diplomatic instincts of a territorial river predator, attempted 3 separate rhetorical maneuvers to establish Kelorian sovereignty over the contested border region. Park simply waited. He acknowledged each point. He placed his own points alongside them with the methodical patience of someone laying stones in a foundation, not bothering to argue which stone was more important, just putting each one where it belonged. At the 6th hour, Varys, who was apparently unused to this particular flavor of resistance, finally said, "Envoy Park, the Directorate's position remains that the original survey designations—" "I'm familiar with the survey designations," Park said, not curtly, just stopping the sentence before it went somewhere unproductive, "and I think both our delegations understand that those designations are no longer operative in describing the situation. The Republic's position isn't that the designations were made in bad faith. People work with the information they have." He paused, set his coffee down. "But the information has changed. We'd like to discuss what happens now given the information we currently share." Varys opened her mouth, closed it, said, after a moment, "That is a reasonable framing." Verath, watching from his position at the table's side, thought, "Yes, that is exactly what it is. Not a concession, not an accusation, not a negotiating position. A simple, clean relocation of the conversation from the past, where the argument lived, to the present, where the decisions had to be made." He'd seen senior diplomats fail to achieve that in 50-hour sessions. Park had done it in a sentence. In the corridor break, 3 hours from the end, Verath found himself next to Park at the beverage station. Accident of timing, genuinely, he wasn't orchestrating it. Park was refilling his coffee. Verath had a container of chilled nutrient concentrate he wasn't really drinking. "You understand," Verath said, after a moment, "that the Directorate's senior officers have read the engagement report from the border system." Park looked at him. Just looked. The way you look at someone when you are deciding whether they are asking what they seem to be asking. "Captain Vasquez's engagement," Verath clarified. "Yes." Park kept his eyes level. "She filed a detailed combat report. I have read it. The Unbroken was operating at 40%. Yes." Again, not curt, just the word, placed cleanly. Verath felt the thing he'd been carrying for 3 weeks. The weight of it, the low-grade wrongness that had started with the casualty reports. Shift slightly, not lighten. Shift, like understanding something doesn't make it smaller, but it makes it fit differently in the space you are carrying it in. "We had a threat assessment," he said. "Our analyst rated your species at Class 4. Park made a sound. It was short, 1 syllable, something between a laugh and an acknowledgement, and he looked at the surface of his coffee for a moment. "I imagine that's been revised significantly. I'm not surprised." He took a sip, looked up. "For what it's worth, and I'm telling you this as a person, not as an envoy, so please take it with appropriate consideration. The Republic wasn't looking for a fight. We genuinely weren't. We have got 400 colony worlds, 6 ongoing terraforming projects, a trade dispute with the Miras Collective that's been dragging on for 11 years, and more internal political problems than I have time to list. The border system is a mining operation, mostly automated. Captain Vasquez was running a supply convoy. He paused. When your cruisers engaged her, she did what her training and her fight, Verath said. Finish the fight, Park corrected gently. There's a difference. Verath thought about Corvathel, about persistence hunting, about the distinction, and it was a real one. He was beginning to understand. A distinction that ran all the way down to the bone between fighting and finishing, between the threat response that burned hot and resolved and the one that metabolized into something structural, something that held you upright past the point where survival math had come out wrong. Yes, he said. I'm beginning to understand that. The final session, on the third day, produced a framework, not a treaty. They were too far from a treaty. There were too many stakeholders, too many directorate officials who hadn't yet made the adjustment that Porath and Verath had made, the slow, cold adjustment from Class 4, low threat to something they didn't yet have a designation for. But a framework, a mutual stand-down at the border, a communication protocol, an agreement to share the Voss-Harlan data revisions through official channels, a joint commission to establish new survey parameters. Park signed it with a physical stylus on actual paper, which his aide had apparently carried in the small case he'd brought from the shuttle. He saw Verath notice the paper and offered a small explanation. Old habit. I find that physical signatures focus people. It's harder to walk back something your hand made. He wasn't wrong. When his shuttle departed, Verath stood at the viewport again. Not Remos this time, just Starfield and the slow withdrawal of the shuttle's running lights, and thought about what had passed. Thought about Telvar Sue, who was, he'd been told that morning, beginning to speak again. Short sentences. Simple things. She wasn't ready to explain what she'd seen, and maybe she never would be, and maybe it didn't matter, because the explanation was sitting in a 90-page report that everyone should have read months ago. He thought about what Park had said, not as an envoy, as a person, and about the difference between fight and finish. And he thought about a species that had been followed, catalogued, assessed, underestimated, and then shot at, and had responded by sending a single ship to clean up the mess, and a diplomat to explain, patiently and without apparent anger, what kind of mistake had just been made. Not even angry about it, really. Just resolute, clear-eyed. Already planning for what came next because that was apparently just how they were. 2 million years of not stopping had made them something that didn't require anger to be dangerous, didn't require display or theater or the theatrical rattling of armaments. They just arrived. With their plans and their patience and their single ship that had taken 40% damage and was still transmitting. Verath called Velen. Send my recommendation to the High Admiral. The preliminary framework needs to move forward to full treaty negotiation, and I want our best team on it. And Velen. He paused. Get me a list of every current Directorate operation within 12 light-years of any known human installation. Velen's crest did the thing. Sir? I want to know what they see when they look at us. Verath said, because I guarantee you they are already thinking about it. They have been thinking about it since the first engagement, probably. That's what they do. He turned from the viewport. I'd like us to be the kind of neighbor that doesn't warrant further thought. Velen nodded, with the particular nod of someone who has just revised an important opinion about the state of things. I will get the list, sir. Thank you. Verath went back to his desk. He pulled up Corvathel's analysis. The full 90 pages, the appendices, the follow-up monograph on human group bonding that the Parastani Institute had published 2 months ago, which was if anything more alarming than the original, and began to read it again from the beginning. Because the one thing Corvathel had made absolutely clear, in the careful exhausted prose of someone who had been right before anyone was listening, was that the worst thing you could do with humans was assume you understood what you were looking at. They had surprised their own homeworld's megafauna for 2 million years. They were exceptionally good at not being what you expected. Outside, the stars held their positions, ancient and indifferent, the same stars the human survey ships had navigated by on their way outward, the same stars Captain Vasquez had used to plot her return course at 40% capacity, filing a combat report requesting repairs, already moving, always already moving. Somewhere in the border system, aboard the HTR destroyer Unbroken, which smelled of recycled air and burnt circuitry, and the specific institutional coffee that Terran Republic vessels always carried too much of. Captain Mara Elena Vasquez sat in her command chair and reviewed the diplomatic transmission summary that Envoy Park's office had forwarded. She read it twice. Then she forwarded it to her XO with a note that said, "Looks like we are not starting a war today. Get me a status on the port lateral thruster array." The XO, who had been aboard the Unbroken for 9 years and knew her captain well enough to read everything that wasn't in the message, sent back, "Thruster status in 20, and Captain good." Vasquez looked at the word for a moment. Just that one word. "Good. Yeah," she said. To nobody in particular. "Let's keep it that way." She meant it the way all her people meant things, right down to the bone. No theater about it. The weight of 2 million years of not stopping sitting easy in her shoulders like something long carried and no longer heavy. Good. Let's keep it that way. The stars outside her viewport made no promises either.